Imagine this. You're asleep in your bed. It's 2:45 a.m. The world outside is silent, your family is safe, and the only sound you hear is the faint hum of the city breathing in the distance. And then, you wake up. Because someone is standing at the end of your bed. A tall, thin silhouette watching you. You can't see his face, but you can feel his eyes. Cold, empty, hungry. Before you can scream, it's too late. This was Los Angeles, 1985, a city under siege. A city that locked its doors and still didn't feel safe. Because somewhere in the dark, a man was choosing his next victim. He didn't have a pattern. He didn't care about gender, age, race, or wealth. He killed anyone, anywhere, anytime. And when he was done, he left behind a message carved into the walls. Hail Satan! Over the course of a single year, one man would terrorize an entire state. He would become known by many names: the walk-in killer, the valley intruder, the night stalker. His crimes were not just acts of murder, they were acts of worship. Worship of chaos, of pain, of evil itself. But what if I told you? Behind this monster was a story far more human than anyone imagined. A story about a broken childhood, unchecked trauma, a fascination with darkness, and a society that unknowingly helped create him. This isn't just the story of a killer. It's the story of fear, how it spreads, how it consumes, and how it changes us. It's about the people who lived through it, the detectives who refused to give up, and the moment when an entire city decided to fight back. Because this wasn't a movie. This was real. And by the time it was over, 14 people would be dead, dozens more scarred forever, and a nation would ask itself one haunting question: how could one man become the face of evil itself? From the dark streets of Los Angeles to the courtroom where he smiled in the face of justice. This is the chilling true story of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. A man who believed the devil guided his hand. In a city that proved even evil can be caught. Welcome to a journey into America's darkest nightmare, where fear had a name and death wore a smile. Los Angeles, summer of 1984. A city glittering under the golden sun. Palm trees, freeways, neon lights, and dreams that seemed within everyone's reach. The city of angels was alive, a symbol of hope, fame, and fortune. But beneath that bright surface, something else was stirring. Something dark. Something evil. People slept behind locked doors, confident that the police and the city's endless hum would keep them safe. But by the time dawn broke, that illusion was shattered forever. Because in the heart of California's paradise, a nightmare had begun. It started quietly, a home invasion here, a random attack there. A woman found murdered in her sleep. Another assaulted in her own kitchen. Police treated them as isolated cases until the details started repeating themselves. No forced entry, no clear motive, and a brutality that defied comprehension. Whoever this man was, he didn't just kill, he enjoyed it. The victims came from all walks of life, rich and poor, young and old, white, Asian, Latino. No pattern, no mercy. That's what made him so terrifying. There was no profile, no method, no target, just chaos. He struck without warning. In the dead of night, he would slip through open windows or unlocked doors as silent as smoke. He could appear in any neighborhood, any house, at any hour. For the first time in its modern history, Los Angeles was afraid to sleep. The killer had no name yet. The newspapers hadn't connected the dots. But among detectives, whispers began spreading about a phantom roaming the city, leaving behind footprints, symbols, and fear. As one detective put it was like the devil himself had moved into LA. What made the crimes even more chilling was the randomness. In most cases, serial killers followed a pattern, an age, a gender, a type. But this man didn't discriminate. He attacked the old and the young, men and women, even children. His victims were chosen by nothing more than chance. The city's heartbeat changed. People started nailing windows shut, installing locks, and sleeping with weapons under their beds. Every creak of the floor, every bark of a dog, every flicker of a streetlight felt like a warning. The once lively nights of Los Angeles turned eerily quiet. But while the city lived in fear, the man behind it, Richard Ramirez, moved through the darkness unnoticed. He was a drifter, a shadow in the crowd. Dirty, unwashed, always wearing black. He blended in among the homeless and the forgotten. He didn't drive expensive cars or live in fancy motels. He rode buses, hitchhiked, and walked the streets. By day, he was invisible. By night, he was death itself. Witnesses who survived described him the same way. Tall, thin, long hair, eyes dark and hollow. Eyes that seemed to look straight through you. One survivor said, "When he looked at me, it was like staring at nothing. There was no soul." And that emptiness, that cold detachment, became his weapon. He moved with purpose. When he entered a home, it wasn't random madness. It was ritual. He would kill, sometimes torture, sometimes leave strange satanic symbols behind. He whispered prayers to the devil, believing his crimes were part of something greater, something holy and evil. By the summer of 1985, Los Angeles had changed completely. The news stations carry stories of horror almost every week. The people demanded answers, but the police had none. Detectives described their frustration. They were chasing a ghost. No fingerprints matched. No weapons were found. He left no clear trail, only corpses and chaos. Then came the pattern they couldn't ignore. At nearly every crime scene, there was one clue, a footprint, from a rare model of shoe. The Avia 440, size 11 and a half. That small detail became the police's only lifeline, the only trace of a killer who moved like smoke. But as the investigation deepened, the killings only grew bolder, more brutal. Ramirez wasn't hiding anymore. He wanted to be known. He didn't fear being caught. He wanted to be feared. By now, the media had a name for him. They called him the Night Stalker. It fit perfectly, a predator who thrived when the rest of the world slept. A man who turned the night itself into a weapon. The Night Stalker wasn't just killing people, he was killing peace of mind. The city's sense of safety evaporated. Parents kept their children inside. Couples slept in separate rooms, so at least one might escape if he came. Los Angeles, the city of dreams, had become a city of dread. What no one knew yet was that this darkness didn't appear out of nowhere. Evil like this had roots, deep, festering roots, buried in a childhood marked by violence, trauma, and twisted belief. The monster Los Angeles feared had once been a boy. And to understand how the Night Stalker came to be, we have to go back to El Paso, Texas, where it all began. Before he was the Night Stalker, before his name became synonymous with terror, he was just a boy, small, quiet, and invisible. Born in El Paso, Texas, in 1960, Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez grew up in a world already stained by violence. His childhood wasn't a story of innocence lost, it was one that never existed. From the very beginning, Richard's world was filled with pain. His father, Julian Ramirez, was a strict, temperamental man, a former policeman and laborer who struggled to control his explosive anger. When he couldn't, he turned it on his wife and children. Richard often witnessed beatings, screams, and broken furniture. The walls of their home absorbed violence until it became normal. As a child, he began sleeping in cemeteries to escape his father's rage. The silence of the dead was safer than the noise of the living. By the time Richard turned 10, his sense of right and wrong had already begun to blur. But the person who finally pushed him over the edge wasn't his father, it was his cousin, Miguel Mike Ramirez. Mike had just returned from the Vietnam War, where he had committed horrific acts. He was a decorated soldier, but also a man who has seen and done the unthinkable. When he came home, he brought with him souvenirs, not medals, not stories, but photographs. They were pictures of women he had raped and mutilated during the war. He showed them to young Richard like trophies, describing each act in detail, laughing, proud, unashamed. To most children, those images would have been nightmares. To Richard, they became education. He admired his cousin. He saw him as strong, fearless, invincible. And the violence that Mike described became something Richard wanted to understand, to imitate. One evening, when Richard was just 12, he saw something that would scar him forever. During an argument, Mike pulled out a gun and shot his wife in the face, killing her instantly, right in front of Richard. The boy didn't scream. He didn't run. He just watched. And when police arrived, he remained calm, almost detached, as if the horror had cemented itself deep inside him. From that day onward, Richard Ramirez changed. In the years that followed, he drifted between relatives' homes, skipping school, stealing, experimenting with drugs, and spending nights wandering dark streets. He began breaking into houses, not for money, but for the thrill of it. He loved the silence, the power of being inside someone's private world while they slept. He discovered pornography and satanic imagery, feeding an obsession with death and domination. The more he read about Satan, the more he believed that evil wasn't to be feared, it was to be worshipped. He found comfort in the darkness, believing it gave him control. While others sought God to escape pain, Richard sought the devil to justify it. In his late teens, he moved to California, drifting from job to job, city to city, always alone, always restless. He worked at hotels, where he was caught stealing from guests, sometimes breaking into rooms for pleasure rather than profit. He slept in cars, alleys, and cheap motels. The streets became his world, a place where no one asked questions and no one cared who you were. He developed a reputation among those who met him, quiet, pale, nervous, with eyes that seemed to hide something unsettling. One coworker later said, "You could tell he wasn't all there, he didn't look at you. He looked through you." As the years went on, his addictions deepened. Cocaine, LSD, and an obsession with the occult consumed him. The line between fantasy and reality began to dissolve completely. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was becoming a vessel for the evil he believed in. By the time 1984 arrived, Richard Ramirez was ready to act on everything he had learned, everything he had imagined. The demons that had haunted him since childhood now demanded blood. And Los Angeles, vast, bright, and full of open windows, was waiting. No one in the City of Angels could have known that the boy who had once watched death in a Texas living room was now ready to bring death to their own. The monster had been born. And soon, the Night Stalker would rise. Los Angeles, June 28, 1984. The city was asleep. The hum of cars faded into the night, the streets glowed faintly under pale streetlights, and in small apartments across town, windows stood open to let in the summer breeze. For Jenny Vinco, a 79-year-old grandmother living alone in her Glendale apartment, this was just another quiet night. Her life was simple, days spent calling her son, watering her plants, and keeping a tidy home. To her, Los Angeles was still the city of angels. But that night, the angels turned their eyes away, because outside her window walked a man who had already made a pact with something far darker. Richard Ramirez had been wandering the streets for hours, his mind boiling with rage, lust, and delusion. Cocaine pulsed through his veins, sharpening his senses, dulling his conscience. He had broken into houses before, to steal, to scare, to feel control, but tonight was different. Tonight, he wanted more. He moved through the shadows, tall, gaunt, and silent. He looked like any drifter, worn black clothes, long tangled hair, hollow eyes. No one would have noticed him. That was his greatest weapon, invisibility. When he passed Jenny's small apartment building, he stopped. The lights were out, the window slightly open. No alarm system, no dog, no car outside. To him, it was an invitation. Ramirez crept closer, testing the screen. It gave way easily. The soft creak of the frame was swallowed by the hum of the city. Inside, Jenny slept peacefully, unaware that death was already in her room. He stepped inside and stood over her, breathing heavily, the smell of sweat and metal filling the air. His knife gleamed faintly in the moonlight. For a few seconds, he just watched her, old, defenseless, peaceful. Then something inside him snapped. He lunged forward, pressing the blade to her neck, silencing her gasp with his hand. Her eyes opened in terror, confusion. He stabbed her again and again, as if driven by something beyond control. The act was frenzied, brutal, animalistic. When it was over, the room was still, except for his breathing. Ramirez stood over the lifeless body, covered in blood, staring at what he had done. But instead of guilt, he felt power. He ransacked the apartment, not for money, but for keepsakes, trophies of his first kill. Then, before leaving, he did something that shocked even hardened investigators later. He mutilated her body. The act wasn't random. It was ritualistic. A symbol of control, of dominance, of evil taking form. When he finally slipped back out into the night, no one saw him. No one heard a thing. The city slept, and the night stalker had taken his first victim. The next morning, Jenny's son arrived for a routine visit. He knocked on the door. No answer. He called her name. Silence. When he entered, what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. His mother's body lay on the bed, lifeless, mutilated, the sheets soaked in blood. The windows were open, the room in chaos. Police arrived quickly, but what they found made no sense. There was no forced entry, no robbery. Nothing to explain the sheer brutality. It was the kind of violence that didn't come from desperation, but from desire. One detective, shaken by the scene, whispered, "This wasn't about money. This was about pleasure." They had no leads, no suspect, no pattern. Just a gruesome murder that felt personal and meaningless all at once. To the police, it was just one case in a big city. To Ramirez, it was a beginning. In his mind, the act had awakened something he could no longer suppress. He felt alive, powerful, untouchable. He had faced the ultimate boundary, life and death, and crossed it without consequence. He began to believe that Satan himself had blessed him, that the devil had chosen him as his soldier on earth. Every breath he took after that night was fueled by the same dark craving. And with each day that passed, his confidence grew. He realized something chilling. In a city as vast as Los Angeles, he could kill again and again, and no one would ever find him. In the following months, the murders continued. A woman stabbed in her bed, another shot in her car, a child abducted and assaulted. Each crime more vicious, more senseless than the last. Detectives began seeing the same horrific patterns, the same footprints, the same satanic symbols, the same mark of pure hatred. And yet, the killer was always gone by the time they arrived, as if he vanished into thin air. The night stalker had discovered his calling. And Los Angeles, though it didn't know it yet, was standing on the edge of a nightmare that would soon engulf the entire city. The darkness that began with Jenny Vinco's final breath was only the first whisper of what was coming. By the time 1985 began, Los Angeles was no longer the dreamland it appeared to be. Beneath its glowing billboards and coastal sunsets, a silent fear began to settle in, a realization that a new kind of evil was stalking the city's heart. People whispered about a killer who moved like smoke, unseen, unpredictable, unstoppable. They said he could appear in any neighborhood, at any hour, in any home. There was no pattern, no motive, only horror. And in those restless nights, a name began to spread, the Night Stalker. But behind that name was a man, Richard Ramirez, whose descent into darkness was almost unimaginable. By day, he was invisible, a gone drifter in black clothes, wandering the city streets, sleeping in motels, alleys, and bus terminals. By night, he became something else entirely, a predator with purpose, a servant of the evil he believed guided him. He prowled the highways, scouring neighborhoods from Glendale to Monterey Park, from Sierra Madre to Arcadia. He'd park his stolen car on quiet streets and simply watch. A flickering light, a half-shut window, a front door left unlocked. He didn't choose victims by age or gender. He chose them by opportunity. To Ramirez, it didn't matter who you were, rich or poor, young or old, you were prey. His methods were as random as his motives. He'd enter through windows, sliding doors, or garages. He'd creep through dark hallways, barefoot, a knife or gun in hand, his heart calm and steady. Sometimes he shot his victims in their sleep. Sometimes he stabbed them, strangled them, or worse. But it was what came after that truly revealed who he was. He wasn't just killing for pleasure, he was performing for the devil. At several crime scenes, police found pentagrams carved into the walls, drawn on mirrors, or even etched into the skin of the dead. He whispered satanic prayers before killing. He told his victims to swear to Satan instead of God. It was as if he believed each act of violence was a ritual, a dark offering to the evil he worshipped. The randomness was what made him so terrifying. Serial killers usually had patterns, age ranges, victim types, preferred methods. Ramirez followed none. He attacked the elderly and the young. He broke into mansions and shacks alike. He stole jewelry, cars, even food, and left behind nothing but chaos. For police, this made him almost impossible to catch. There was no logic, no sequence, just carnage. Detectives worked around the clock, crossing city lines, comparing evidence, and trying to piece together fragments of a pattern. One clue, and only one, began to emerge again and again: a footprint. A rare shoe imprint left in blood, dirt, or dust at several crime scenes. It was from an Avia 440 sneaker, size 11.5, a model so uncommon that only one small shipment had been sold in Los Angeles. This single clue, a footprint, was the only physical trace of the devil haunting their city. Meanwhile, the press began to pick up the story. Each headline grew darker than the last. Serial killer stalks Los Angeles. City gripped by fear. Satanic. Killer strikes again. The Night Stalker had become a living myth. Half man, half monster. People claimed to see him everywhere. Some said he could walk through walls. Others swore they saw his eyes glowing in the dark. The fear wasn't just physical anymore, it was psychological. Los Angeles was beginning to believe it was cursed, and Ramirez loved it. He read about himself in newspapers. He watched the panic grow on television screens. The more the city feared him, the stronger he felt. He wasn't hiding, he was feeding off the chaos. Each time he entered a new home, he felt unstoppable, as if Satan himself was guiding his hand. He left behind the same message, carved in walls and whispered in the ears of the dying: "Hail Satan!" He believed it was his mission, to be the devil's instrument on earth, spreading fear through violence. But what Ramirez didn't know was that in his overconfidence, he was also leaving behind a trail. The shoe prints, the bullets, the car thefts, the tiny mistakes that would slowly expose him. For now, though, Los Angeles remained trapped in the grip of a ghost. The police were desperate, the people terrified, and the Night Stalker, the devil in the shadows, was just getting started. He was no longer just killing for pleasure. He was killing for fame, for power, for the darkness that had consumed his soul since childhood. Every scream was a prayer to his God. Every victim, an offering. Every night, another victory for evil. And as dawn broke across the city each morning, the question echoed through every household: who will he come for next? The streets were quiet, but the fear was louder than ever. Because when the sun went down, everyone in Los Angeles knew one thing: the devil walked among them. By the summer of 1985, Los Angeles, once a city of dreams, had become a city of dread. Fear wasn't just in the air. It had seeped into every home, every street, every restless night. The name Night Stalker echoed across television screens, whispered in grocery stores, and carved itself into the minds of millions. This wasn't an ordinary crime wave. This was terror, alive and unpredictable. The panic began to take shape in subtle ways. People who had once strolled through neighborhoods now ran inside before sunset. Hardware stores were stripped clean of locks and metal bars. gun shops sold out of ammunition, and entire neighborhoods began forming night patrols, watching every car, every shadow, every flicker of movement that passed their street. No one knew who he was or where he would strike next. Because the truth was even worse than anyone imagined. He could strike anywhere. One night, it was a quiet suburb in Monterey Park. The next, a family in Arcadia. Then, a couple in Whittier. Rich or poor, young or old, it didn't matter. The night stalker had no type, no pattern, no mercy. Newspapers called him a phantom. Police called him the devil. And the people of Los Angeles called him by only one word: fear. Women slept with the lights on. Men sat in living rooms clutching baseball bats. Parents kept their children in the same room, terrified to be apart. Every sound at night, a creak, a footstep, a knock, sent hearts racing. One survivor later said, "It felt like he was everywhere. He could be outside your house, looking in your window, and you'd never know." That thought alone was enough to shatter the illusion of safety that Los Angeles had always lived by. The local news stations began broadcasting warnings every evening. Lock your doors, shut your windows. Don't sleep near open spaces. Helicopters circled neighborhoods. Police presence doubled. And yet, despite all this, the killings didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. Every new murder felt more brutal, more defiant. Ramirez wasn't just killing, he was performing. He wanted the world to know his name, his message, his devotion to evil. He began leaving symbols of Satan at crime scenes, pentagrams drawn on walls, carved into skin, smeared in blood. He forced victims to swear to the devil. He laughed during his attacks. And when he left, he made sure his victims, or their families, would find those symbols. It wasn't just a murder spree anymore. It was a psychological war. The city wasn't just afraid of dying. It was afraid of the idea that pure evil could walk among them, blending in, smiling, breathing the same air. The police were breaking under the pressure. There were more than a dozen murder sites, each slightly different. Different weapons, different methods, different areas. The press hounded the LAPD daily. Are these cases connected? Why haven't you caught him? Is Los Angeles safe anymore? Behind closed doors, detectives knew the truth. They were chasing a ghost. They had almost nothing to go on. No fingerprints that matched any database. No witnesses who could describe his face clearly. Just one haunting clue, the Avia 440 shoe print, stamped into the dirt or blood at multiple crime scenes. A shoe so rare that only one store in the entire U.S. has sold that model. Detectives began calling him the man with the black Avias. And while the city spiraled into panic, Richard Ramirez watched from the shadows, amused, empowered. He read about himself in the newspapers. He listened to the radio reports. He smiled when he heard his new name, the Night Stalker. It was everything he had wanted, fame through fear. He believed he was unstoppable, chosen by the devil himself. Every scream, every headline, every terrified citizen was proof that his master was pleased. He began taking more risks, staying longer at crime scenes, taunting his victims, leaving messages like, "Hail Satan," on their walls. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was hunting openly. But the panic that paralyzed the city was about to turn into anger. Because while Ramirez believed he ruled the night, the people of Los Angeles, the ones he terrorized, were slowly uniting against him. Neighborhoods began organizing watch groups. Police forces across the state started working together, sharing evidence. And two detectives, Gil Carrillo and Frank Salerno, were closing in, determined to end the nightmare once and for all. The chase was about to begin. And for the first time, the devil in the shadows would start to feel the light. By mid-1985, Los Angeles was a city on edge, a metropolis divided by fear, yet united by one question that haunted every sleepless night. Who was the Night Stalker? Every police department across Southern California was on high alert. From Los Angeles County to San Francisco, detectives worked around the clock, hunting a ghost who left no clear pattern, no consistent motive, and no trace, except for death. At the heart of this investigation were two men, Detective Frank Salerno and Detective Gil Carrillo. Salerno was a veteran, calm, methodical, respected. He had already solved one of the most infamous serial killer cases in California history, the Hillside Strangler murders. Carrillo, younger and fiercely determined, brought a new energy to the force. But when he first suggested that the recent string of murders, random, brutal, and satanic, were all connected, even his colleagues laughed. But Salerno didn't. He listened. Because deep down, he knew the chaos wasn't random. It was one man. Over weeks, the evidence started to align like pieces of a nightmare puzzle. Different crime scenes, same weapon calibers, same signs of torture, same satanic symbols. In one house, a pentagram smeared in lipstick. In another, the words Jack the Knife scrawled on the wall. Every scene radiated the same kind of madness, controlled, deliberate, ritualistic. Carrillo and Salerno pored over photographs, reports, and autopsy files. They started to see what others missed, a chilling consistency and chaos. They noticed the footprints again, size 11.5 Avia 440s, the same rare sneaker. It appeared in Glendale, Monterey Park, Arcadia, and Sierra Madre. That was the break they needed. Police sent the shoe impression to Avia's headquarters. When the results came back, they were stunned. Only one pair of that model and size had been sold in Los Angeles County. It was confirmation. The same man was behind it all. But who was he? That question became an obsession. Detectives followed every lead, ex-convicts, drifters, registered sex offenders, but every name led to a dead end. The killer moved like a phantom, crossing police jurisdictions, changing his weapon and method with every attack. Sometimes he used a knife, sometimes a gun, sometimes both. He killed in Los Angeles one night, then 400 miles north in San Francisco the next. It was as if he was mocking the police, daring them to catch him. Meanwhile, the media frenzy exploded. Reporters called it the most terrifying manhunt in California history. Headlines screamed, "The devil's servant stalks the city." Every day, the public demanded answers, and every day, detectives faced the same wall of silence. The pressure grew unbearable. Detective Carrillo barely slept. He carried pictures of victims in his jacket pocket, reminding himself what was at stake. He said later, "You could feel the evil in every file you touched." Salerno, stoic as ever, told his team, "We're not chasing a man. We're chasing a monster." As weeks passed, the killer's brutality increased. He began leaving messages at scenes, as if communicating with investigators directly. "Hail Satan," a five-pointed star. Even taunts about the police. He wanted to be known and feared, but his arrogance would soon become his undoing. In August 1985, a small but critical clue surfaced. In one of the latest murders, the killer had stolen a Toyota. Police found it abandoned days later in Wilshire Center. Inside were partial fingerprints, smudged, incomplete, but still readable. When the prints were sent for analysis, the lab called back with a name that would send chills through the entire department: Richard Ramirez, a petty criminal with a record of burglary, car theft, and drug use. Mugshots matched the eyewitness sketches from survivors. The black hair, hollow eyes, and rotting teeth, it was him. The Night Stalker finally had a face. On August 29, 1985, the Los Angeles Times plastered his image across the front page. "The Night Stalker identified." The article warned, "Public advised to stay vigilant. The suspect is armed, extremely dangerous, and still at large." Detectives hoped the exposure would corner him. Instead, it would lead to one of the most dramatic captures in American criminal history. Because when Ramirez saw his own face on every newspaper, he realized something: the devil might protect him in the dark, but in daylight, the people would not. The city he had terrorized for months was about to turn against him. By late August 1985, Los Angeles was holding its breath. After months of terror, the faceless killer who had haunted the city's nights finally had a name and a face. Richard Ramirez, age 25. Thin, dark-haired, pale, with hollow eyes that looked as if they had seen too much darkness to ever see light again. For nearly a year, he had been the invisible terror of California, a man who could appear in one city, kill, and vanish before sunrise. But now the mask had been ripped away. The headline that morning blared across every newspaper in California. The night stalker identified, his mugshot, the haunting, dead-eye face, stared back at a city that had lived in fear for too long. And with that image, everything changed. When the story broke, Ramirez was 100 miles away, completely unaware. He had just returned to Los Angeles after a short trip to Arizona where he'd been visiting family. He stepped off the Greyhound bus at the downtown terminal, dirty, tired, wearing black from head to toe, but the city he had once walked through unnoticed now knew his face. As he entered a convenience store in East Los Angeles, he noticed something strange. People were staring, whispering. One man looked at him, then at the newspaper stand nearby. And there, on the front page, was his own photograph. Ramirez froze. The headline screamed his name, Night Stalker. For the first time, the hunter felt fear. He dropped the items in his hand and bolted out of the store. The cashier shouted, "It's him, it's the Night Stalker." Within minutes, the alarm spread through the neighborhood. People ran into the streets. Some shouted. Others grabbed weapons, bats, pipes, anything they could find. Word spread from block to block like wildfire. The Night Stalker is here. For months, these same people had lived in fear, sleeping with lights on, locking every window, jumping at every sound. Now their fear was turning into fury. Ramirez ran. He sprinted through alleys, across busy streets, jumping fences, desperate to find a car to steal. But everywhere he turned, people recognized him. At one point, he tried to pull a woman from her car to hijack it, screaming at her to get out. She resisted and screamed. That scream echoed through the street, and suddenly doors flew open. Dozens of neighbors poured out, angry, shouting, determined. They had found the monster. What happened next was unlike anything the city had ever seen. Men and women chased Ramirez down the block. Some carried metal bars, others wooden planks. They caught up to him near Hubbard Street, cornering him against a fence. Ramirez fought back, but he was outnumbered. They struck him, on the head, the arms, the ribs. He stumbled, bleeding, terrified. He shouted, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." The same words he had never given his victims. By the time the police arrived, Ramirez was lying on the pavement, bruised and bleeding, his black hair matted with blood, his once defiant eyes filled with panic. The officer who handcuffed him later said, "The devil looked human that day." News spread instantly. People cheered in the streets. After months of terror, the city finally had justice, or at least the beginning of it. Detective Frank Salerno and Gail Carrillo arrived shortly after to take custody. When Ramirez saw them, he smirked through swollen lips. "You got me," he muttered. "But you'll never make me talk." But as they drove him away, the streets erupted in applause. For the first time in months, Los Angeles felt safe again. The man who believed himself invincible, chosen by Satan, feared by millions, was now just another prisoner, handcuffed and broken. At the station, Ramirez was booked and photographed. He smiled, a crooked, eerie smile that unsettled even the most hardened officers. Under his breath, he whispered, "Hail Satan." When reporters shouted questions at him, he didn't flinch. He loved the cameras, the chaos, the attention. He wasn't just a killer anymore. He was a symbol of his own twisted mythology. But behind that smirk was a man whose power was gone. The predator who had hunted in the shadows was now trapped in the spotlight, exposed, powerless, and alone. As detectives gathered more evidence, fingerprints, shoe prints, weapons, the case against him grew airtight. Every detail, every symbol, Every word he had left behind became part of a story that the world would never forget. But the capture was only the beginning. Because what came next wasn't just a trial, it was a public confrontation with evil itself. The world would soon see the real Richard Ramirez, not the myth, not the shadow, but the cold, soulless man who called himself a servant of the devil. And when he finally stood in front of the court, he wouldn't hide or beg or deny. He would smile, because in his mind, even in chains, he still belonged to the darkness. When Richard Ramirez finally walked into the Los Angeles courtroom in 1988, the world held its breath. 3 years had passed since his arrest, and the terror he unleashed still lingered like a shadow over California. But now, the devil's servant, the man who had haunted millions, stood in the light of justice. And yet, he smiled. From the very first day of the trial, Ramirez turned the courtroom into his stage. He arrived wearing black sunglasses and a smirk, his long hair framing his gaunt, pale face. On his hand, he had drawn a pentagram, which he proudly displayed to cameras. Raising it high and declaring, "Hail Satan," the crowd gasped. Some reporters described the moment as chilling, others called it a performance. But to Ramirez, it was something more, a declaration. He wasn't here to repent. He wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to revel in the chaos he had created. The courtroom was a battleground of horror and disbelief. On one side, the prosecution laid out a mountain of evidence: ballistic reports, fingerprints, shoe impressions, and testimonies from survivors. On the other, the defense tried to argue insanity, claiming that Ramirez's obsession with Satanism and delusions made him mentally unstable, but the facts were undeniable. Witness after witness described the same haunting figure, tall, thin, with piercing eyes and a rotting smile. Ballistics matched his gun to multiple murders. The rare Avia 440 shoe print, found at numerous crime scenes, matched perfectly to a pair found in his possession. And his fingerprints sealed his fate. Every day, the evidence grew heavier, more damning, more horrific. But what shocked the public most wasn't just the crimes, it was the crowd that came to worship him. Outside the courtroom, dozens of young women gathered daily, calling themselves Night Stalker groupies. They wrote him love letters, sent him photos. Some claimed he was innocent. Others said he was misunderstood. For them, Ramirez wasn't a monster. He was a dark icon, a symbol of rebellion. Proof of how even pure evil could become famous in a world obsessed with spectacle. One journalist wrote, "It was as if the devil himself had a fan club." Inside, the victims' families sat through every gruesome testimony, the photos, the stories, the horror replayed in detail. Many broke down. Some couldn't bear to stay. Yet Ramirez remained emotionless, as if the pain of others amused him. He smiled when victims cried. He laughed during autopsy reports. One woman, whose parents were among his victims, stared at him through tears and whispered, "You'll burn for this." Ramirez turned to her and grinned. "No," he said softly. "I'll burn with pleasure." It was the kind of arrogance that reminded everyone he wasn't insane. He was aware, deliberate, and proud. After months of testimony, hundreds of hours of evidence, and one of the most expensive trials in California's history, the jury finally reached its verdict. On September 20th, 1989, the judge read the words that millions had waited to hear. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Ramirez, guilty of 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries." The courtroom erupted in gasps and sobs. Ramirez didn't flinch. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he smiled that same cold, empty smile and spoke the words that would echo through history. "You don't understand me. You never will. I am beyond good and evil. I am well beyond your experience." Hail Satan! The judge sentenced him to death by gas chamber. As the verdict was announced, reporters noted the surreal contrast in the room. On one side, tears and relief from the victims' families, closure, justice, long overdue. On the other, a man with dead eyes and a smile, muttering prayers to the devil. But beneath the surface of Ramirez's defiance was something else, the crumbling illusion of control. For the first time, the world saw through his mask. He wasn't a supernatural being. He wasn't immortal. He was a broken, twisted man, one who believed worshipping evil would make him powerful, only to end up caged and forgotten. In the years that followed, Ramirez became an infamous figure, not for what he achieved, but for what he represented, the seductive power of fear and the danger of glorifying darkness. His story forced America to confront its obsession with serial killers, how society turns monsters into celebrities. But for those who lost loved ones, the trial wasn't about psychology or media spectacle. It was about the human cost, the lives stolen, the peace shattered, the nights forever haunted. The night stalker was no longer in the shadows. He was behind bars, surrounded by walls, guards, and silence. But his shadow, the fear he created, would linger for decades. And deep down, Ramirez relished it. Because in his mind, even if his body was trapped, his legend still walked free. When the iron doors of San Quentin prison closed behind him, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, was finally where the world believed he belonged, caged, powerless, and forgotten. Or so everyone hoped. But inside those gray prison walls, he was far from silent. Behind the bars, behind the infamous smirk that had terrified millions, lived a man who had become something more dangerous than a killer, a myth. On death row, Ramirez was placed in a small concrete cell, a single bed, a small sink, a slit of a window that let in just enough light to remind him what the outside world looked like. But he wasn't broken. He wasn't remorseful. He smiled. Always. That same cold, eerie smile, the one that had stared out from courtroom photos and newspaper headlines. Prison guards described him as calm and polite, even charming at times. But beneath that calm exterior, his eyes still held the same hollow darkness. He never apologized, never admitted guilt, never showed a shred of empathy. When a journalist once asked him if he felt sorry for his victims, Ramirez simply said, "No, I don't believe in the hypocritical moral crap people talk about. Evil has always existed. Evil will always exist. I just decided to be part of it." Those words sent chills even through hardened investigators. Psychologists tried to decode him. They found no remorse, no sense of right or wrong, no emotional depth. To them, he was the purest form of psychopathy, an individual who could mimic human emotion but feel none of it. And yet, his behavior was full of contradictions. He spent hours reading books on Satanism and philosophy, drawing pentagrams, and writing poems. He claimed to follow Satan, but at times he also talked about destiny, fate, and power. It was as if Ramirez didn't truly worship the devil, he worshipped himself. He believed he had become a symbol, a dark icon of rebellion, chaos, and control. And the world, disturbingly, encouraged it. Even in prison, Ramirez received hundreds of letters. Some from curious fans, others from people who called themselves followers, and many from women who claimed they loved him. They sent him pictures, confessions, marriage proposals. To them, he wasn't a murderer. He was mysterious, dangerous, charismatic. This fascination wasn't new. Society had always been drawn to monsters, trying to understand them, humanize them, even romanticize them. But in Ramirez's case, it went beyond fascination. It was obsession. In 1996, he married one of his admirers, Doreen Lyoy, a magazine editor who claimed she saw something good in him. She described him as kind, intelligent, misunderstood. It was a chilling reminder that even behind bars, Ramirez's power, his ability to manipulate minds, was still alive. Yet, for all his fame, he was completely alone. He spent years in isolation, surrounded by concrete and silence. He had no contact with other inmates. The only voices he heard were those of guards and the distant echoes of the prison. Over time, the myth of the Night Stalker began to fade. New crimes, new names took over the headlines. But Ramirez remained in his cell, waiting, not for freedom, but for death. He once said in an interview, "I'm beyond salvation. The law can't touch my soul. Only death can." For years, he lived under the constant shadow of execution, knowing that one day the gas chamber awaited him. But he wasn't afraid. In his mind, death would only make him eternal. And yet, when you strip away the myth, the headlines, the symbols, the satanic rituals, what remains is something painfully human. A man born into violence, raised in trauma, fed by addiction, delusion, and hate. A man who mistook fear for power and darkness for purpose. Behind the smirk was no genius, no mastermind, just a broken human being who found comfort in destruction. Even after decades in prison, that smile never disappeared. To some, it was defiance. To others, it was emptiness. But to those who survived him, and those who hunted him, it was a reminder of something far more terrifying, that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes, it looks like a man who smiles. Richard Ramirez's smile haunted every photograph, every courtroom video, every documentary that followed. It was the smile of someone who saw life as meaningless and death as entertainment. But as the years passed and his fame faded, the monster behind the smile began to decay, physically and spiritually. His teeth rotted, his health failed, and the once untouchable night stalker became just another inmate waiting to die. He had wanted to be eternal. But in the end, he was forgotten, even by the darkness he once worshipped. Because evil, no matter how loud it screams, eventually rots in silence. On June 7, 2013, the story of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, came to a quiet and unceremonious end. At San Quentin State Prison, where he had spent over 2 decades on death row, Ramirez died of complications from B-cell lymphoma. There were no final words, no grand satanic gestures, no smile this time. He was 53 years old, frail, forgotten, and alone. And just like that, one of the most feared men in American history, the monster who once turned Los Angeles into a city of nightmares, slipped silently into the past. But his death didn't erase his presence. In some ways, it made him more haunting. Even decades later, people still ask the same question: what makes someone like Richard Ramirez? How does an innocent child become a man capable of such horror, of walking into homes, taking lives, and sleeping peacefully afterward? To understand that, you have to go back long before the murders, before the Satanism, before the fame, to his childhood. Ramirez grew up surrounded by violence and trauma. His father was abusive, his home unstable, and his earliest lessons about power came from pain. At a young age, he met his cousin, a Vietnam veteran who showed him photos of women he had tortured and killed during the war. That cousin became Ramirez's role model, his teacher in cruelty. One day, Ramirez watched that same cousin shoot his wife in the face. He was 13 years old. It was a moment that fractured whatever innocence remained in him. From then on, violence wasn't just something he witnessed, it was something he accepted. But trauma alone doesn't explain evil. Many people suffer, but they don't become killers. Ramirez was different because he chose to embrace his darkness. He didn't fight it, he fed it. As an adult, he began using drugs, breaking into homes, and drifting through life without purpose. The more lost he became, the more he clung to the idea of Satan, not as a religion, but as a symbol of rebellion. To him, Satan represented freedom from rules, guilt, and morality. By invoking evil, he gave his crimes meaning. He believed he wasn't killing out of hatred, but destiny. That's what made him so terrifying, his complete unshakable conviction that what he was doing was right. But history remembers him differently. Richard Ramirez wasn't a demon. He wasn't supernatural. He was a mirror, reflecting the darkness that society often refuses to acknowledge. He showed us that evil doesn't always come from monsters in the shadows. Sometimes, it comes from people we pass every day, quiet, polite, unassuming. The man who smiled in court, who joked with reporters, who married admirers, he looked human. But his humanity was long gone. And that's the most chilling truth of all. Evil doesn't always look evil. The legacy of Richard Ramirez is one of pain, but also of progress. His case changed the way law enforcement investigated serial crimes. It brought different police departments together under one unified system, sharing evidence and data, something that hadn't existed before. It also helped advance forensic science, especially the use of DNA and fingerprint databases, which became vital tools in catching killers who once would have vanished into the dark. But beyond the legal and forensic impact, Ramirez's crimes left a psychological scar on survivors, on detectives, on an entire generation who grew up afraid to sleep with their windows open. For the families of his victims, justice didn't erase the pain. For them, Ramirez's death wasn't closure, it was just an ending to a story that never should have happened. In the end, the Night Stalker didn't win. He wanted to be eternal, to be feared forever. But time eroded his myth. Today, his name stands not as a legend, but as a warning, a reminder of what happens when evil is romanticized, when fear turns into fascination, when empathy fades. He taught the world that darkness can wear a smile, but it always burns out in the end. As the years pass, Los Angeles has healed. The houses he broke into have been rebuilt, families have moved on, and the city that once trembled under his shadow now stands bright again. But for those who remember, the detectives who hunted him, the families who mourned, the survivors who lived, his story is more than just true crime. It's a testament to the resilience of humanity, that even when faced with unspeakable evil, people still rise, still fight, and still refuse to surrender to fear. Because while evil may leave its mark on history, it is good that writes the final line. The Night Stalker is gone. But the lessons he left behind, about fear, justice, and the human condition, remain carved into the soul of a nation. And maybe that's the only legacy worth remembering, not his darkness, but the light that overcame it.